The oak-paneled office of Sterling and Associates smelled of expensive cigars and cold indifference. I sat on the edge of the velvet chair, my fingers tracing the frayed hem of my coat, while Mark adjusted his $10,000 Rolex. Across the desk, the divorce papers lay like a guillotine blade between us. Mark didn't look at me. He was too busy texting Tiffany, his spiritual advisor, who happened to be half my age and twice as ambitious. "Just sign it, Sarah," Mark sighed, his voice dripping with the boredom of a man dismissing a long-term employee. "I'm giving you the old sedan and $5,000 to disappear. It's more than you're worth, considering you've spent the last decade just existing." I picked up the pen, my hand steady despite the roar of betrayal in my ears. "I don't want the car, Mark. And I don't want your alimony." He finally looked up, a mocking smirk dancing on his lips. "Found a billionaire already? I want your mother," I said, my gaze locking onto his. "I sign I leave and Diane comes with me. Permanently." Mark froze, then let out a sharp, jagged laugh of pure relief. "You want the burden? Deal." He scribbled a check for $5,000 and slid it over like he was paying a trash collector. "Consider this a tip for taking out the garbage." The iron gates of the estate groaned as I pulled the U-Haul onto the gravel driveway. Inside the house, the air felt thin, stripped of the warmth I'd spent 12 years cultivating. I found Diane in the laundry room, sitting on a stool, clutching a faded cardigan like a security blanket. She looked smaller today, a fragile ghost in a house that had already moved on. As I helped her toward the door, my daughter Sophie descended the stairs. She was draped in shopping bags, wearing a necklace Mark had clearly bought to buy her loyalty. I reached out to touch her shoulder, my heart aching for one last connection. "Sophie, honey, the truck is ready." "Are you sure you?" She stepped back, her eyes cold with a superficial hardness that mirrored her father's. "I'm staying here, Mom. Tiffany says we're going to Paris next week. Why would I move into a cramped apartment with a grandma who can't even remember my name?" Mark appeared behind her, arms crossed, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He didn't say a word as I led Diane past him. He just watched us go, his silence the loudest betrayal of all. I helped Diane into the passenger seat, the $5,000 check heavy in my pocket, and drove away without looking back at the life that had turned to ash. Our new reality was a cramped, two-room cottage where the floorboards creaked in protest of every step. For 3 weeks, I survived on instant noodles and the $5,000 disposal fee Mark had tossed at me, while Diane sat by the window staring blankly at the rain. I was at my breaking point, sobbing over a pile of unpaid utility bills, when a firm hand landed on my shoulder. I gasped, turning to find Diane standing tall, the vacant haze in her eyes replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. "That's enough crying, Sarah," she said, her voice resonant and commanding. Not a single tremor of the senility Mark had mocked at. I stumbled back, heart hammering. "Mom? You're okay." "I've been okay for years, dear," she whispered, locking the front door with a decisive click. But in that house, being sick was the only way to hear what Mark was whispering behind closed doors. She knelt by the hearth, prying up a loose plank to reveal a heavy steel-bound box. "Mark thinks he's a self-made king, but he's just a squatter. I kept the original deeds, Sarah. This cottage? It sits on the only land he doesn't own. And the basement beneath his mansion? It belongs to us." While Diane and I plotted our return in the quiet of the cottage, Mark's glamorous new life was beginning to fracture. Without my constant nagging about budgets and taxes, he had surrendered the checkbook to Tiffany's bottomless appetite for luxury. Through a contact in the old neighborhood, I heard the whispers. Tiffany had replaced the loyal house staff with her influencer friends, and the mansion's legendary gardens were brown and dying. But the real karma hit when Mark tried to expand his business. He called me one evening, his voice frantic, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Sarah, where is the deed to the West Wing? The bank is threatening to freeze my line of credit because of a title discrepancy. Just tell me where you hid it, and I'll send you another $5,000. I leaned back, watching Diane methodically highlight sections of the legal documents she'd kept hidden for years. "I didn't hide anything, Mark," I replied, my voice as smooth as glass. "Perhaps if you spent less time in Paris and more time reading the fine print, you'd realize that some foundations aren't yours to build on." I hung up before he could beg. The shark was finally circling his own sinking ship, and he had no idea that I was the one holding the bait. The courtroom door swung open with a heavy rhythmic thud. Mark sat at the defense table, his suit wrinkled and his face a mask of sweating desperation. Tiffany sat beside him, frantically checking her reflection in a compact mirror, oblivious to the legal storm about to break. When Diane and I walked down the center aisle, the room went deathly silent. I wore a tailored navy blazer, my head held higher than it had been in a decade. "What is this?" Mark stammered, standing up. "Sarah, you don't belong here. This is a private bankruptcy hearing." Diane stepped forward, her heels clicking like a metronome against the marble floor. She didn't need a cane. She didn't need a hand to hold. She looked at her son with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the air in his lungs. "Actually, Mark, I'm here as the primary creditor." Our lawyer laid a single yellowed document on the judge's bench. "The power of attorney Mr. Harrison used to mortgage the estate was forged 3 years ago," he announced. "Mrs. Harrison never signed it. In fact, she has officially transferred all property rights and management of the family trust to her daughter-in-law Mia." Mark collapsed into his chair, the blood draining from his face as the judge hammered the final nail into his coffin. The mansion, the business, the very ground he stood on, it was all gone. I looked at the man who had traded me for a disposal fee, and for the first time I saw him for what he truly was, a tenant who had finally been evicted. The dust had barely settled on the courtroom floor when we walked out into the crisp autumn air, leaving the wreckage of Mark's ego behind. A week later, Sophie showed up at our cottage, her designer bags replaced by a single worn suitcase. She stood on the porch, crying, realizing that Tiffany had vanished the moment the credit cards were declined. I looked at her, my daughter, who had traded a mother's love for a trip to Paris, and I didn't open the door. "You chose a lifestyle, Sophie," I said through the screen. "Now you have to learn how to build one." Diane and I eventually moved back into the mansion, but we didn't stay. We sold it, using the proceeds to open a sanctuary for elderly women who had been cast aside by their own families. Mark's $5,000 disposal fee sits framed in my new office. A reminder that justice isn't always fast, but it is absolute. As I watched Diane tending to the new rose bushes, her eyes bright and her spirit free, I realized that I hadn't just saved a mother-in-law. I had saved myself. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the architects of a life built on a foundation that no one could ever take away.